Yes, I think, being in a state of neutrality in your consciousness to where you're actually allowing things to unfold before you prejudice something is very difficult at this current space and time because what I see is everybody's sort of high on the I told you so. Everyone wants to be the
Yeah.
I told you so, like
Yeah.
I was right, and everyone seems to really be animated and energized by that energy. And I think we have to get to a place where our affinity for the truth has to supersede the want to be right. Because if you
Mhm.
just want to be right about everything, then it's going to skew your viewpoint to where you're not able to see clearly and observe clearly and actually have open space for things to unfold.
Welcome back to another episode here. We're going to continue this discussion of our current moment and how we can find some directions of making progress moving forward. Today I'm joined by people you've seen on the channel several times before, Dr. Madhava and David Helfrich. Madhava is a physician, an engineer, and he's also worked at Children's Health Defense as a senior science editor. David's a lawyer, a political consultant who most recently worked on Marianne Williamson's presidential campaign. Both of them bring a deep and meaningful insight to the nature of our current moment and how we might move forward in a healthy way. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, gentlemen, it's been a little bit since we had a chance to do this, and funny enough, I mean, 10 years worth of stuff has happened in the world since we last connected like 3 months ago. So it's, there's lots to talk about. But how you guys doing overall so far?
I'm doing wonderful. It's really good to be with you guys again. And yeah, I agree. It's just, you know, even if you look towards November to current day, it feels like a year.
Yeah,
And a lot has happened. But it's good to be with you brothers yet again.
yeah.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
There you go. I was waiting. I was waiting. I feel like we're dealing with a delay here, but it is what it is. Um, so, I mean, with all that said, I'm going to kind of start things off by saying, I was actually at a bit of a service for a past relative yesterday, and in that service, the priest was talking about just kind of the nature and the state of the world right now, and he brought up this idea that there's this incredible amount of polarization, division, but he took it a step further and was essentially saying, no matter where you look, whether it's the media, politicians, so on and so forth, he's like, everybody's lying. And it's just lies and lies and lies and lies everywhere. And what struck me about this was, here's just like, someone who's average, everyday human being that, runs a church service and is speaking to his community every week. And the fact that this type of conversation of everybody is lying to us in positions of power, the fact that this is so commonplace now, it's just, when I think back 10, 15 years ago, most people wouldn't be talking in a community space. And now it's as if like it's complete common knowledge amongst a mass amount of the collective. And it just kind of says a little bit about where we are. And I kind of wanted to just start by getting almost like a litmus test from each of you of kind of like where you feel we are right now, right? Maybe you can speak to a lot of what's going on in the US to some extent, because obviously that's a big place, but just from a high level point of view, like we'll get into specifics, but from a high level point of view, like what's the zeitgeist right now from your perspective?
Well, I think the challenges we're facing in the United States in particular is there are so many competing and vying factions for power, and everyone is sort of identifying, I think, in increasingly more insular bubbles to where they just sort of want to be with their so-called tribe and look after their own per se. And that automatically and reflexively seems to be building contempt for the other, whatever that group is. And the United States is sort of an experiment in the sense that it's a pluralistic society. But now that the word diversity has sort of become this charged term that is so contentious and has been misused and people have different views on it, the fact remains that the United States and Canada, for that matter, are pluralistic societies. So the strength is in out of many come one, right? And if we don't really subscribe to that and don't see that there's commonality amongst us, and if we can't rally around foundational principles, regardless of who we are, then that just creates an environment where division is going to be the rule of the day. And when you have that, certain factions get into power and they try to hoard the power. And because we've had such institutional decay and corruption, the level of trust has been at an all-time low that I think most people are willing to say, hey, let's just completely burn this system to the ground and build something up. And I think through that process comes a lot of growing pains, which we're in now. But to me, it's only going to work if in a society like the United States, which is highly pluralistic, if people can sort of rally around some commonalities in terms of what do we really identify with as our core principles? Like, what do we even believe in? What are our shared values? I don't think there's really, when you ask Americans, I don't think a lot of them are going to agree on what those values are or even know what those values are, other than, I want my team to win.
Yeah. Well said. Lots to pick apart there, but let's go to Madhava first here for his take.
Well, I would come at it from the top down, aligned with what you said about the pastor's position that this average person is able to apprehend the fact that everybody's lying. And I see this as an incredibly hopeful sign, because that's the first step in understanding that the solutions are not coming from the top down anymore. And everything that's been happening over the last year or so has actually led me to look at what the astrologers are saying about what's happening to us collectively as a conscious society. And I think what's interesting here is that, first of all, before we discount the pseudoscience of astrology, which is usually made because we think that, it's impossible for Pluto to control the way we behave as a society, I look at it more like we're watching a cyclical progression of society, with shifts that happen every 20 years or every 200 years or every 2,000 years. And with regard to the latter, we are moving into the age of Aquarius, which the astrologers say is going to herald the advent of bottom-up solutions. In other words, the truth is going to come from the bottom, no longer from the top. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. We're watching this happen in front of us, where we are, first of all, as you said, collectively understanding that the top is not telling us. The authorities have been wrong, and they keep doubling down on their ridiculous positions. And, the arbiter of what is true is going to be the collective. It's not going to be the institutions of science or the political talking heads. The talking heads on mainstream media or what our leaders are saying. It's going to be coming from the bottom. And this shift is going to manifest in what we're seeing right now. And if we consider the arbiter of truth to be collectively obtained with regards to, say, science or facts, it's also happening with regard to the exchange of value. The blockchain technology, which is seeing an explosion in popularity, is basically a bottom-up solution where the arbiter of a valid transaction is, in fact, the collective. So we see this happening in front of us. And I view the confusion that's happening right now as an enormously positive sign. And so if that is actually what's happening, it is more useful, I think, to focus on how do we make sense of things as opposed to what is the truth. Yeah. What is our approach to determining what is valid and what isn't? And this is where there is a void of, I think, intelligent discussions around this that are not polarized, but can rely upon a methodology, if you will, of making sense of things. So I'll just start there. That's what I see, and what I really appreciate about collective evolution in all of the years that you've been putting out content is there's always been that sense of let's take a breath and figure out how to make sense of what's going on. That's the most important thing right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the pat on the back there. That's that's the focus here. But no, I took a bunch of notes because I think there's a lot of pieces here that you guys both shared that I want to double click on. But I want to start somewhere particular, which is actually around this idea of, several people are discussing a coup essentially that has taken place here between sort of the Trump-Musk type situation of what's happening in governance. And there's a lot of discussion around technocratic sort of dictatorships that are being emerged. And I mean, I've seen several people who I respect their take on things and their research kind of propose this idea. But specifically too, and I wanted to bring this up because this is a big discussion to pull apart, but David, you also have some connection to one person who has this feeling that you worked closely with, which is Marianne Williamson. And I kind of wanted to start the question because ultimately the question will be, do you guys feel this is what's happening with the Trump and Musk situation? But David, like, what is your take even from what you know of Marianne? I mean, this is her position. Do you feel like she's correct in what she's seeing? Why do you think she's holding this position? That kind of stuff.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on. I mean, I can't speak for Marianne, but I do know that she comes from a particular point of view, which is sort of classical liberalism, and that she's been ensconced in a lot of, elite liberal circles. And that is a prominent view in those circles today. It's almost like you almost have to have that point of view if you're going to be accepted in some of those spheres. That said, I do think she's genuine in what she's saying. I think she genuinely believes that. And I think we should be aware of the dangers of a technocratic oligarchy, which is very apparent right now. You talk about Elon Musk, his connections to Peter Thiel, JD Vance has connections to both of them. In his previous life, he sort of worked in, private equity field. And there's a lot of business connections at play here. I mean, let's just be honest. We live in an oligarchy. We have prior to this administration. Now it's just apparent. Now it's just in everyone's face.
Yeah.
I mean, Donald Trump's a billionaire. Elon Musk is allegedly the wealthiest guy in the world. And yeah, there's a real danger that they're going to essentially hijack government to do their bidding. I mean, Trump's already talking about building the Riviera in Gaza and, building Trump towers and construction. Of course, that's going to benefit him and all of his friends. Elon Musk wants to build an architecture of surveillance, which I think is going to be very dangerous. It's already actually in motion on the border. And, what that can mean in terms of violating the civil liberties of Americans, I think is something that we shouldn't underestimate. That said, we also have to give space that there could be some good that can be done here. It's not necessarily the case that just because somebody is a billionaire and comes from the private sector and comes into government, that they're automatically nefarious and going to be self-serving. Unfortunately, we have to be skeptical and suspicious of that, given the lineage and history of how there's been such corporate capture of essentially every government agency. And it's no different now under the Trump administration. And I do think people, not of the Marianne Williamson side, they're very clear about the danger. But I do think a lot of people on the right and even the Maha crowd, which I support, I do think they underestimate the dangers of the Trump administration just because they're so happy to see somebody like Kennedy as secretary and head of HHS, that they're willing to sort of, overlook some other dangers that could be coming through the pipeline. But I think it's complicated. I don't think it's as simple as saying, particularly a month into the administration, that we know for sure what's going to take place.
Yeah.
But we can't put our blinders on and act like just because the status quo has been disturbed and disrupted, that now sort of everything is on the up and up and we should just give sort of presumptive legitimacy to Elon Musk and Donald Trump because we like the fact that they're replacing a different establishment.
Well, I think that the idea that we're watching a coup happen is misplaced because the coup happened a long time ago. I would suggest that a coup happened when the Federal Reserve was put into play in 1913, just months after we had our first income tax. Those were the two acts of Congress that really solidified the coup, and we're talking 112 years ago, and it's led to what we're seeing now. We are our prosperity as individuals has been depleted by the fiat currency that's been used to fund governmental deficit spending year after year. We are in a tremendous amount of debt. We have a large percentage of our tax revenue is going to interest payments on money that was created out of nothing. And this means what? It means that we are waking up to the fact that something is blatantly awry. And so the reality is, as we're all touching upon, is that we have an oligarchy, and now we have, a technical guru in Elon Musk and his 19-year-old, geniuses that are mining through governmental databases looking for signals. Yeah, it's going to happen that way. Let's be real here. If we expect that there's going to be a new administration that's completely transparent and has incredible integrity and is truly interested in the people, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. It's going to come piecemeal. It's going to come stepwise. There's going to be exposure of bureaucracy, and then there's going to be a lot of, I would say, irreversible damage that's being done by trying to get rid of the rot. We're going to cut away good tissue, if you will.
Yep.
It's not all going to be cancerous that comes out.
Yep.
So I would suggest, as David alluded to, let's be patient. We're only a month into this administration, and I'm not saying that we should trust Elon Musk or Donald Trump, who are in the billionaire class, but I think we should be able to accept the fact that what does a billionaire or a multi-billionaire want? I think it's misplaced to think that, they're after our money. They're going to they're going to go into our accounts or take away our money. That's been going on for for a century now. They've been taking away our money through taxes and other burdens for a very long time. And the idea that a small team of fact finders are going to have access to personal data, look, that's probably going to be part of the problem. If you think that your data is secure and safe with the U.S. government, I mean, now we're really, you have to ask yourself, what exactly do you trust? Every other day we hear, data dumps coming out of insurance companies or whatever, and sorry, we got hacked. So our data is out there, and I agree we should try to protect it, but it's already out in the open as far as I'm concerned. So, so my point here is, what do the billionaires want, right? They want control over the way we think and the way we behave. And this is where we have to keep our eyes open and understand when we're being lulled into policies that take away our freedom to choose. That's where we have to draw a line in the sand, is we're not going to comply. We don't have to go along with that. And this is, primarily the very first attack on our ability to be free is our ability to express ourselves. And if we were to judge what has happened so far with the change of administration, I would say we moved in a positive direction. Hopefully, all of the transgressions that the Biden administration were able to pull off over the 4 years should be exposed for what it is. And this is going to happen stepwise, and let's be patient.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, listening to both of what you guys are saying there and just thinking about from my own perspective here, it's like we've struggled collectively to, for a very long time, sort of identify what the problem is. And when we say what the problem is, I mean, we're just talking in totality, what is driving politics, what is driving, the way our government is designed, what is driving policy, why, are certain people getting more power all the time and comfort and money while others are just losing over and over. And we always seem to think that it's, collectively at least, kind of one political side or another. And then there was a group of people, you might say, which is kind of like the alternative thinkers and the alternative media, who identified more of a larger systemic issue. But yet now here we are in this, let's say, very sort of ripe moment of seeing so much change happening so fast. And Madhava used the word confusion earlier, and how there's this massive confusion going on. And I'm now seeing that level of confusion be as prominent amongst the alternative sphere as it sort of has been in, let's say, the consensus viewpoint. And what I find is so interesting about this is it's sort of revealing this mode where everybody is trying to know every day what exactly is going on, what exactly are the intentions, how can we predict the exact intentions. Like, I don't want to look stupid saying that I support this person or I don't support this person or this. And it's sort of revealing these issues we collectively have with identity, with uncertainty, with our ability to just kind of be in the I'm not sure what's going on, and like that's okay. It's almost like I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues in the independent media space just ripping on people who are giving some leeway, who are curious about the fact that some good things are happening in this administration. It's like there's no allowance for a middle ground. It's just you have to be either these guys are all bad or these guys are all good, and that's now it's permeated everywhere. And it now seems like there's only a tiny minority of people who are actually in that space saying, you know what, I'm not 100% sure what's going on. I can see that there are good and bad things happening, and that's an okay place to be in. And I'm curious what you guys feel about that.
Yes, I think, being in a state of neutrality in your consciousness to where you're actually allowing things to unfold before you prejudice something is very difficult at this current space and time, because what I see is everybody's sort of high on the "I told you so." Everyone wants to be the "I
Yeah.
told you so," like I was right, and everyone seems to really be animated and energized by that energy. And I think we have to get to a place where our affinity for the truth has to supersede the want to be right. Because if you
Mm-hmm.
just want to be right about everything, then it's going to skew your viewpoint to where you're not able to see clearly and observe clearly and actually have open space for things to unfold, because you're trying to steer a certain result all the time. And in today's society where everyone can curate their own timelines on YouTube and the media they consume, it's very easy to get into a position where you think you're right all the time because you're constantly being reinforced with information and data and even pieces of evidence that substantiate whatever your viewpoint is. So I think this gets around to what I was talking about earlier about rallying around first principles. Because and one of those first principles can be, hey, listen, my love for the truth supersedes my political identity or my view on vaccines or my view on politics and who I want to be elected. We have to allow some of these higher principles to sort of take precedent over the squabbles of the day. And I think that's the challenge a lot of people are having when, particularly in the United States, when the environment is so contentious and divisive,
Mm-hmm.
that there just seems to be such a disdain for people on the other side that nobody wants to allow space for anybody to have any kind of redemptive moment or for a truth to emerge that might challenge one's preconditions. And and I don't think we have a lot of, I think CE and Madhava, I think you guys are shining examples of that consciousness, but there's not a lot of examples out there of that because most people are steering a very particular kind of propaganda, and it's we're in a state where people are warring with different propaganda, and it's like which propaganda is going to win
Yeah.
versus is the truth going to emerge?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of great things there. I think for me, it's important to start with something deeper than the facts and what's happening on a day-to-day basis in terms of conversations. What I feel is that we are limitless beings, conscious beings that have no end. And I believe that the actual struggle is happening at a different plane right now. Like in this plane of reality, of physical reality, there's going to be dark and there's going to be light. There's going to be shadow and light. That's the reality. And we run into problems when we take up the idea that we have to extinguish the shadow. We have to, excise the evil. We have to kill them or destroy them. That is a low vibrational approach to where we are right now. And I would suggest that we are fighting with the puppets, the bad people out there, whoever you think it is, whether you think it's Trump or Fauci or Kennedy or whatever. Those are people. Those are puppets. Actually, they're programmed to act a certain way by the puppeteers. Who are they? I don't know who they are, but I would suggest that metaphysically, there's always been a desire to control, and there's a desire to liberate. They go hand in hand. You cannot have a shadow without light. So uh, I suggest stepping back and understanding that if you want to really enforce or exact change on the planet towards the better, you have to embody the puppeteer, and that means embodying an energy that is able to not necessarily demand that we extinguish the bad, which is impossible, but to stand firm on freeing minds and freeing yourself and staying in a place of neutrality, as we're suggesting. And I'm not saying going along, I'm saying hold fast and not comply when those kinds of forces are acting upon you. Now, if you were a puppeteer that are controlling the dark forces, the best thing you could do is to get all of us, the 7 billion people who are not billionaires or more, to embody the puppet. How do you embody the puppet? Well, that means you have to be angry. You have to declare yourself to be right, and you have to deride the other side, which is a very, very good way of keeping people engrossed or ensconced in their position. Because once you start attacking the other person publicly, you throw insults, you now have a bias against seeing the truth because now you've got to eat crow. You have to sit there and say, oh, geez, I said all those terrible things about people. I'm not going to look at the truth because that's actually too painful. It might be even a subconscious influence upon the way you think because you just can't face the fact that not only were you wrong, but you were publicly wrong. And now you have to face the embarrassment of saying things that in retrospect are not only unfounded, but unkind. So there, again, I'm speculating. I'm saying that if you are the puppeteers up there, they want us to fight. They want us to attack each other and call the other side stupid. And I suggest that if you ever are in a place when you're engaging on social media and you feel the need to attack someone to denigrate somebody, you should take a step back, take a breath, and maybe take a look at where you might be wrong. Because if you are that certain, you're probably deluded at some level. So be very, very careful when you engage with someone because you're actually helping them. You're helping the people who are trying to sow confusion on the planet by engaging in this kind of behavior. So as we move forward, it's like, look, let's realize that this is happening on multiple metaphysical planes, if you will. It's happening at this level with the concrete material stuff, and it's also happening at a spiritual level. And approaching the quandary that we're in right now with regards to confusion, the wise thing is to understand that you can never be certain about the truth. The truth is always out there, but it's never accessible. The best thing we can do is point out where we are not looking at it properly or clearly. When we look at things clearly, we'll eventually have to understand that we can't be certain about what's going on, but we can be certain about what is not going on. And that is, I would suggest, a prescription for getting through a world that's replete with confusion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, there's a place for, because this idea of, let's say, anger, it has been sort of like a big discussion as of late where, let's say when I look at my experience with CE as a brand, we've often said over the years, like, hey, you don't want to get stuck in anger. And people, I think, had a really hard time understanding what we meant. I think they often thought, never get angry. And now there's sort of almost like a resurgence of like, no, we should be angry and we need to use that anger to fuel what we're doing. And so there's almost a justification now for the puking of anger online, getting into big fights, getting into battles, all these things as a way of this is part of the spiritual battle. We are supposed to use this anger. And this is kind of now the belief. But so I just wanted to kind of hit this really quick because I think, at least, and Madhava, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't hear you saying, hey, when you feel the sense of anger that our boundaries are being crossed by elites that are doing things that are not in everybody's good, you can feel that momentarily. But the idea here is to allow that to process and move on and not get stuck in that state of perpetual anger and then creating, all of this, let's say, conflict between those of us who disagree and so on and so forth. Is that essentially how you would describe it as well?
Can you say that again? I want to be very clear that I'm understanding what you're saying. Say that one more time, because that was a interesting statement you made. What am
Yeah,
I
like
saying? Tell me what I'm saying.
essentially, from a physiological point of view, as beings,
Yeah.
when our boundaries are crossed, right? Which can be anything from a physical insult to somebody systemically does something that limits you. There's a natural reaction within your physical body to say, hold on a second, you crossed a boundary. And in a healthy way, that physical reaction should last about 90 seconds. And so what that is essentially it's a sympathetic nervous system turning on saying, you know what, a boundary was crossed. This is ancient, right? This is an ancient response that would be used when you actually had to fight. We don't actually have to physically fight a creature right now, but there's still that ancient response. And when we do not cling and we do not repress, that energy of anger lasts about 60 to 90 seconds, right? That is a healthy processing of anger. Then the wisdom that emerges from that would be, my boundary has been crossed. What am I going to do about this? Right? So as the sympathetic response starts to come back down and we get back into a place of, being within ourselves, not where the anger is at its height, we will see clearly again, and we will be able to take the wisdom of that anger and say, what do we do with this? Right?
Yeah.
But what we see often in society is that anger response emerges and then we cling and it doesn't finish coming down. Right. And so I'm kind of, this is the clarity I was getting from you in terms of how do you see it in your own lens? And does that sound about right?
It does sound right. And I would say that what keeps us in a non-useful state of anger when that happens? And I think it boils down to a misinterpretation of who you are as a conscious being. If you think that you have a limited lifetime with limited time and to acquire all of the pleasures and accomplishments that you desire in your life, then these kinds of insults are an existential threat to you. Because you're thinking, well, if they take away this, then I'm screwed. No more. I don't have any more chances to have happiness. And so the insult becomes magnified. On the other hand, if you regard yourself as a transcendental or limitless being that transcends death, that you have an infinite number of possibilities to extend beyond this lifetime, then you can get away from the anger state and realize that you're being attacked and a boundary is crossed, but this does not necessarily mean it's an absolute end to who you are, what your desires. It's a temporary one. And this is why coming at it metaphysically is more important now than ever before. And so, in other words, I agree with you. The anger itself is a low vibration energy, which comes through fear, and fear is connected to our survival instincts. So the reality is that you cannot die. I mean, your physical body will die. I understand that we're talking about things that are very provocative, and not everyone is going to buy into this. But I suggest that on this planet has been a very, very long amount of exposure to propaganda, whether that be through religious doctrine or from science that tells you that no, you're once you're dead, you're gone. There's no more, and this puts us into a state of fear, because once they can threaten your existence, you now are fearful. And it's very, very difficult for a authority to control a population that is not fearful. And this would be the motivation for keeping us locked in this idea of you need to respond with anger. Anger is natural. Anger is good. Anger is what's going to save you. Actually, what's going to save us right now is clarity. And clarity can only come from a state of detachment from this idea that your survival is dependent on what happens right now.
David, what do you think?
Definitely. I think, two things I would say. One, to speak on what Mana was talking about in terms of the metaphysical nature of it, it is a game changer philosophically if you integrate the idea that you are limitless, meaning there's no beginning or no end to your soul's journey. That is a game changer, but it's only a game changer if you truly embody it. It can't just be, oh, that sounds cool, right? That's an interesting philosophy. It has to be something that you actually integrate into your life. And I think that takes a lot of the pressure and anxiety off because once you can really embody that, there is no rush to enlightenment. There is no this feeling like, oh, if I don't get it right in the next, 10 years and it's over and then we're all going to die and there's nothing to that. It counterbalances sort of the meaninglessness of the philosophy that says, hey, listen, you're going to live and you're going to die and that's it. But secondarily, I think that the human being is the ultimate alchemist. So we can turn anger into productive energy. And Joe, what I thought you mentioned was really important in terms of sort of the appropriate processing of anger, because people either get lost in the anger or they suppress it to the point where they never allow themselves to process it. And then it can manifest in really ugly ways later on if they're not sort of honoring the fact that, wow, I'm angry. Where is this anger coming from? Let me process it and actually honor the anger in a sense so that I can sort of get back to my neutral point and understand where that came from. Because I think a lot of times humanity looks at darkness like it's something else or evil, like that's for other people, but never for me. I could
Right.
never be that.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, no, there are, as a human being, there are dynamics of all of these energies and emotions in all of us. And I think we have to integrate that instead of always trying to destroy something we don't like. Because when we do that, all we do is suppress it, fail to acknowledge why it's there, and then we never sort of learn the lesson. And then that's also a situation where people can sort of self-aggrandize themselves as being only light beings, right? We're only full of goodness and obviously if we look at the world, we know that's not true. There's another aspect, there's a shadow side that we still are trying to understand. But I think part of that is allowing ourselves to process all of these emotions. And I think Madhava's philosophy is a beautiful one because if you come at it from the perspective of I'm a limitless being, to me that takes a lot of the pressures off and allows you sort of to go on about your experience in a way where you're not so subjected to the puppeteering going on in the exoteric world of the here and now. You have sort of a grasp of something beyond that that can be your anchor point, and I think that can be very valuable.
I want to add something to that. And yeah, those are good insights, David. The There's a downside to holding on to this philosophy, and this has something to do with anger, which is first of all, if you believe you're a limitless being, um, you can be used, right? Because there's no longer this desperation to act and make things good. You can just say, ah, well, that's the way it is right now. And this has been used very, very effectively in my own culture in India. You have that's the whole basis of the caste system, right? Because they're saying, look, that's what you're born to clean latrines, but don't worry, next lifetime you'll have a better life. So stop complaining, do your duty. That's what they say in the Bhagavad Gita. If you're a warrior, go fight. If you clean latrines, go do your duty. So we have to be very careful with that. And this is where anger, I think, is important to use it appropriately, is to say, no, that's wrong. And before just deciding to capitulate to the fact that this is the way it has to be for this lifetime, no, it doesn't have to be that way. You can exact change in your own life, very productive change, and you don't have to be stuck in a way of being. So it takes a lot of self-reflection before just subscribing to one philosophy or another. And so it's a balance between understanding that, yes, you're limitless, but that doesn't mean that you have to sit on your laurels and not act.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, it's an important point. And I mean, interestingly enough, one of the other interviews in this series I did was with Daniel Pinchbeck, and this exact question was proposed because, we kind of went metaphysical, and then we were talking about the physical world. And probably one of the largest elements of confusion that I've witnessed over the last, I guess 16 years now doing this work is, you kind of have this material world where people feel like, aggressive activism is the way to exact change. But then you have sort of these spiritual, almost new agey type beliefs, which can sometimes put people in a position where they're like, well, nothing matters and everything is what it is and blah, blah, blah. And it feels like there's truth in both of them. But that there's this integration of like, why would we be incarnated as physical material beings if we were supposed to just, oh yeah, but it all is just is what it is, and it'll change when it changes, and it just, but then also, why would we have this spiritual undertone and this meaning of how consciousness experiences itself to evolve? Why would we throw that all the way and pretend it's only just material, right? So it seems like there's this deeper integration that seems to be occurring now. And again, what's interesting about this is, obviously, as we're talking, one of the thoughts that I have in my mind is that, there's billions of people who in no time soon are going to walk away, let's say, from their religious beliefs that may or may not align with, some of the ideas that we're sharing. Like, obviously, several religions that I'm aware of kind of have this idea that when you pass on, you go on to another place, and that we are souls in a sense, but not really, here we're going to come back to life in another, or, in another body, or, there's still this feeling that, this is it, this is the only life, and that kind of thing. And maybe we do something else somewhere else. So the question here is we're sharing this planet with 7 billion people who all have very different philosophies and probably won't adopt a philosophy. Earlier on, Madhava, you mentioned this idea of almost like a methodology of navigating this confusion and this chaos of this current moment. Given that we're philosophically probably not always going to be on the same page, maybe we can discuss a little bit of like, what is that methodology of how we make sense of our current moment, given that there's foundational beliefs that are spiritual that we may not share? How do we essentially move about our material world regardless of our spiritual beliefs, essentially, in this moment?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, obviously.
Specific to the methodology, like, just to be clear, you
Okay.
mentioned specifically, you were
Mhm.
like, the approach is important in terms of how we go about making sense right now.
Yeah.
And this has obviously got to be something that can go across the board.
Well, the first thing I would say is that uh, I'm going to answer the question, but notice as a culture or as a society, we have been evolving. I mean, forget about the technology. I'm just saying that the way that forces of control have been acting in so many centuries before was to actually physically, contain people, make
Yeah.
them your serfs and subject them to all kinds of horror. And as time went on, we started to have authorities that are supposed to be for the people, let's say. And so we have a say now in what kinds of powers are granted to our authorities. We're now in a place right now where the battle is about thought forms. How do you convince people what to do? And the dark side, if you will, the forces that look to control, have to be more wily right now. They can't just simply take on physical power and subject us to cages. They have to trick us into walking into the cage. So discernment right now is more important than anything else. Luckily, especially for someone like me who's 5'7" and 145 pounds, I don't have to fight with my fists anymore. I can fight with my pen, or discuss things in a proper way. So, what is the methodology? And this has to do, and this is my favorite question. What do you do when experts disagree, for example? That's a very, very relevant question all the time, because the experts right now are the authorities, and this is how they're influencing us. And how do you know whether you can trust them or not? Well, I would suggest that the the first thing is to avail yourself of the fact that there are people who know more than you that are disagreeing. And, it was almost 5 years ago, Joe, we did that piece on what do you do when experts disagree. This is the kind of discussion that is more relevant today than ever before.
Yeah.
And there's a way to actually approach this. And the first is to first accept humility, in the sense that you actually won't know who is right, because these people, by definition, know more than you do. And they're both going to claim the same things, that they're right and the other person is wrong. And obviously, we've talked about this many times before. The difference is that one expert is going to ask for a debate and the other person doesn't. And that in and of itself should be a big warning flag for someone who's not an expert, to say, why should I go along with the person that doesn't want to debate something? And that is the big difference between the two. And interestingly, that's exactly what was being suppressed through the COVID years, if you will. Yeah. And there's a reason for that, right? Because if you go back to the original studies done by Solomon Asch in the early 50s, when he did a very, very interesting experiment to understand the power of groupthink. Have we talked about this before? Is it worth going into? I don't know, but I'm just going to say that, he did a very, very simple experiment where there was a very easy task at hand, which is to identify which, drawn line matches the same length of three other lines. And it was a very easy task. And he did a control experiment first, which demonstrated that 99.4% of the time, people would get the line right. It's a very easy task. But when they're placed into a situation where there are 11 people who were not part of the experiment, who one by one all named the wrong line as being the correct to the referent, 1/3 of the responses now of the subject went along with the group. Now, why is that? Well, there's a certain tendency to go along with the group. So why is this important? Well, there's two things. First of all, is that there was no carrot or stick here with regards to this experiment. There was no, like, you don't get slapped in the wrist for getting it wrong. You don't lose your medical license if you get it wrong. You just got it wrong, if that's what wrong is. But nevertheless, 1 out of 3 respondents picked the wrong line, even though they knew they were picking the wrong line, because they just wanted to comply. What's interesting about this experiment is that in subsequent tests, that delusion, if you will, going along with the presumptive legitimacy of the majority, was immediately and significantly crushed by having a single dissenter in that group of 11 people who were programmed to pick the wrong line. Once there was one person that was speaking the truth, most of the people now all picked the right line because they knew that there was someone else that agreed with them.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why the suppression of dissenting arguments is extremely important in creating groupthink. This is why qualified voices were excised from the conversation, let's say during COVID, for example, or what's happening with 9/11, for example. The people who are qualified to speak don't get to say anything if they disagree, because that's that's a very important strategy of a authority that's trying to control the way we think, is that you have to eliminate dissenting opinion. Now, one last thing is let's look at it from the expert's point of view. You're an expert, and you believe that you're right. Like, forget about you're trying to mess with people's minds as an expert. Let's just assume that you're right, and you're talking to someone who's not an expert. How are you going to approach this person, right? I mean, are you going to sit there and decree that you know more than they, therefore they have to comply with what you're saying? If you're smart and you're an expert, you should understand that the person you're talking to is incapable of appreciating your argument or appreciating the fact that your argument is more valid. So when you approach that person with the idea of deriding them for not agreeing with you, you are actually not being very smart as the expert. So this is another reason why tone and discussion is very, very important, not only to come to the answer, but when you're sitting there saying as a layperson, I don't know who to believe, it's logical to go with the person who wants to discuss things with the expert in open conversation. And it's also logical to dismiss someone who is denigrating you for not going along with them. So, what is a methodology? This is a very big question that we're facing right now. The methodology is we should be demanding open transparency about the facts and about science, about things that are beyond us. And if I'll bring it back to what's happening on the planet right now, I believe that Bobby Kennedy's position in the HHS has huge implications about what is going to happen on all fronts, because this man is demanding radical transparency.
Yeah.
Not only he's not going to tell us what the data is, he's going to open it up for independent analysis of the data with regard to chronic disease and, say, toxins, whether they be vaccine related or not. When you have a scientific establishment that is continuing to double down and call him a crazy nut job, I say you need to really take a closer look at what the authorities are saying and what their motivations are. And this is going to be a thread that gets pulled on, and the whole tapestry of the curtain is going to come down. It's just a matter of time. So this is another reason why I'm very encouraged, and why this simple methodology, if you will, is going to lead us closer to clarity, if not to the truth.
Yeah. David, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think when my response to that is when you look at the value and utility of free speech and freedom of expression, I think an underrated component of that is the art of persuasion, because a lot of people think that just because I have the facts or I think I have the truth, that I can just dictate to other people what that is and they have to accept it, as opposed to understanding that even if you are an expert on a certain subject, armed with the evidence, that you still have to persuade people that they should look at this and allow them to come to a determination themselves. Because I think it's really only valuable for people to come to enlightenment or acknowledgement if they go through that process themselves. They can't be dictated to. And I think for so long, if we're talking about Kennedy and we talk about the prior regime, they wanted to dictate to people what the truth was and say, and there was almost this paternalistic dynamic to it, to say, we know what the truth is, we know what's better for you, it's not open for discussion, we're just dictating to you, as opposed to an approach that I think Kennedy will take, where he even said, I think in his address to HHS, I'm willing to be wrong. I will leave space that I'm wrong, and let's let the facts play out. And I'm going to open this process up that you can come to your own conclusion and make your own determination. But I do think that this question of discernment is interesting, because while I agree that discernment is of paramount importance, what I'm often seeing is people are still delegating discernment to other sources. And right now, a big danger in that is AI. Like, I see a lot of people who will distrust anything mainstream media will tell them, well, they'll run to ChatGPT or run to some AI DeepSeek. And whatever AI says, they're like, oh, yeah, well, this is what AI said. So this has got to be, this is the absolute truth about it. And it's like, we're basically exporting that critical thinking to AI. We're just saying, we're just kind of displacing it and supplanting mainstream media with something else that we like. And of course, the danger of this, in particular, I think if someone like Elon Musk gets a hold of it, is that they're going to determine what the truth is. And AI is going to be seen as sort of this objectivist arbiter of truth, the ultimate adjudicator. And of course, that brings a lot of dangers in itself. And then finally, I'll say some of the pitfalls of sort of the alternative community and higher consciousness and spirituality that I see is that a lot of people are excusing themselves from day-to-day tasks and day-to-day concerns and challenges that we face on the planet, because it's very easy to say, I'm a multidimensional being, I'm just going to tap into some other reality because I don't want to deal with this one.
Yeah.
And I think we see the ramifications of that as our world degrades, but people are sort of wishing or channeling that they're on some other space, another dimension. Yeah. Even if we are multidimensional beings and we're existing on multiple planes, there's a reason we're embodying this physical vehicle right now at this time. And I think what Madhava said is very important in terms of understanding that, but not resting on your laurels, and also acknowledging that maybe you lived, if we're talking about this metaphysical analogy, maybe you've lived multiple lifetimes where there wasn't an opportunity for mass enlightenment and awakening, but all of a sudden you're born in a certain time and space with technological advancements that now you're able to actually expedite the growth process in one lifetime that maybe took you 10 lifetimes to do previously. So I think there's also a fascinating way to look at the responsibility it takes,
Yeah.
even if you fancy yourself a spiritual multidimensional being, to actually get in the game and engage in the 3D reality and the tangible realities that we're in to make our world better. Because if we can't, then what is the utility of all this awareness and higher consciousness if we can't even effectuate basic improvements in our day-to-day life, such as improving water quality, soil quality? If we can't even do that, how are we going to effectuate change in the 11th dimension, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and this I was actually thinking about this the other day with regards to Marianne Williamson and her deciding to run for president back in, well, I guess it was 2016 was the first time she went for it. And I remember the early days, 2009, 10, 11, 12, all that kind of stuff, doing CE, and we obviously always had a very metaphysical, spiritual kind of approach to things, but very much integrated into making sense of current events and our physical and material world, and how do we actuate change and create a better world where we can thrive and all that kind of jazz. And the generally at the time, the spiritual folks would be very, almost like it's completely negative to look at anything that's going on in the world. The material world is not important. We're just these beings that are all that stuff was there. But now, and this is where I loop in Marianne, it's like, since she started to kind of really get on that track, she sort of acted as somewhat of a permission space creator for other people who were very, very spiritual, in a sense, to finally go, well, yeah, I guess maybe it is important to kind of understand the body politic a little bit. And I guess maybe it's not that negative to kind of see the corruption, right? And so it was kind of, as much as I didn't agree with Marianne on a lot of things, and I kind of, in my own ways felt her take was a bit naive, I appreciated the permission space that she was creating in the larger collective for, getting people to say, you know what, this is about, you came to live this human experience to live the human experience, right? Like, you might as well play and enjoy. And I find what you hear a lot is this, it's like a black and white orientation, right? It's like, either I'm a spiritual being, and therefore if I look at anything that's corrupt, it's negative and bad, or I'm a material being and I have to engage fully and everything else out there is not important. And I just find humanity as one of these major evolutionary changes is we're just becoming a culture that, like, I think we're literally up against the confines on a cultural level of this dualistic, basic, black and white ideological thinking, and we are being forced into accepting nuance, complexity, something deeper, getting into quantum physics, like all of these things that suggest our reality is so much more complex than we sort of accepted for a very long time. And I find this is happening on such a cultural level. And I mean, obviously my feeling is I go back to, we need to create the physiological conditions for people to be able to hold that complexity. Because when you're stressed out and afraid, it's very hard to hold complexity. But I do see this as like a big sort of cultural moment. And it's kind of exciting because I will admit it was frustrating at times before, when you either have the black and white thinkers over here, the black and white thinkers over there, but now there's so much more going on. So yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to add that to this whole picture. I don't know if you guys have a comment, or we can shift gears real quick. What do you
Well,
think?
yeah, I just wanted to say something real quick, about Marianne, because as you know, I've been engaged in politics. I've been associated with everyone from Ron Paul back in the day, Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, Marianne Williamson, and all of them have gold. Like, all of them have delivered some gems to the body politic. And Marianne's contribution is that she did sort of give people permission slip to talk about the spiritualization of politics.
Yeah.
And I actually think we're in a better space because of pioneers like that. Like, even when you listen to Bobby Kennedy talk about his approach, I mean, there's a spiritual dynamic to what he wants to do. And for so long it was just, well, you only could talk about that in sort of the traditional religious sense, right?
Yeah.
In terms of your
Christian.
religious denomination, you had to be safe. But now that it's a little bit more open in terms of the way people are conceiving it. And of course, even if you break down the word politics, it really means to make a body polis or a coherent field. And the term body politic really should reflect the healthy state of the physical human body. And I think when you look at the body politic and it's disjointed and it's divided and it's toxic, that is also a resonation in terms of where the human body is. And I think there is a reason to be encouraged now, because I do think the body politic is moving to a healthier place where figures outside of the normative conventional ways of thinking about politics and spirituality and religion are now sort of getting access to positions of power. And I mean, that can be dangerous in a sense of somebody abusing that power, but I think it's something that had to happen. And, somebody like Marianne, I think, has contributed to sort of breaking that glass. And I think it's interesting. It was an interesting point you made. So that's all I wanted to say on that.
Yeah, cool. Madhava?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. Look, what I gathered from the last 10 minutes of us talking here is that things are very complicated, whether it has to do with what you believe, but also down to like materially, like collective evolution. You guys just put out this post about how we never really touch anything. That's what the physics say, right? We're not actually what good is that? I mean, it was a good post, Joe, but when it comes to these things, how is it going to help us? How is quantum physics going to help us? We can talk about the fact that there's uncertainty when you come right down to looking at the tiniest parts of matter, right? We don't know what the momentum and location of electrons are. We just can't know. I mean, it's part of how the universe is built. How does that help us? Well, I don't know, but if anything, it should at least say that we don't actually know everything. More importantly, though, when it comes to these things in terms of discernment, is you have to have a very, very sensitive meter that detects when you are being coerced into doing something. That should set off all kinds of alarms, like, whoa, pay attention. They're making you do something, right? And they're trying to convince you that you either are stupid for not choosing A, or if you don't choose A, we're going to punish you. Those things have to be considered very, very deeply before you commit to one side or the other. So I would say that's an important part of part of your methodology, let's say, in terms of deciding what is true. If there is another force that's telling you that you have to do something, that's where you need to take a closer look. And what are some other things you can employ? Because your question about what is the methodology, I think, is very important. I don't want to lose this because there's many things we can add to this. Here's another exercise. Can you argue the opposing position's position?
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Completely. Let's switch. This is a really great exercise you do in psychotherapy or couples therapy. Can you argue the other person's position accurately and completely? If you cannot do that, then you haven't listened to the other side yet. You don't understand where they're coming from, and that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Are you? The other one is, ask yourself what it would take for you to change your mind. What do you need to see? And if you really come down to it, I would say most people, with regards to these contentious issues, if you ask them what would it take to change their mind, they're going to say, well, it's when my spokesperson, whether that be the New York Times, Donald Trump, or whoever, when they say that you're right, then I'll believe in you.
Yeah.
So you have now automatically outsourced sense making to a third party. You're free to do that. But notice that that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so this is where we have a way of unpacking things and unpacking the faith that people have in third parties is go to another subject and show them where their selected spokespersons for their position has been really wrong or deceptive, and bring in the uncertainty. It's like, now, hold on a second. Now, do you take it as complete 100% certainty and faith in this person? Well, that person is not infallible. So these are where openings can happen. There was something else I was going to say about what David just brought up, but can't find it now. So
Well, I
please go
just
ahead.
wanted to chime in real quick because I think what Madhava said is really important. I think one of the most important exercises you could do in debate is to first stillman the position of the person you're debating with. Because
Yeah,
so often, how many times you hear a debate and somebody's making claims about what somebody thinks, and that person's like, I never said that. That's not
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
think.
yeah,
yeah,
But if you can actually stillman the position and say, okay, I understand your position and there's nuance and there's validity to what you're saying, then you can actually engage with that person instead of vilifying and misrepresenting their views. And
yeah,
we're gonna get nowhere in discourse if we do that. And I think, Madhava mentioned Bobby Kennedy. I think Bobby Kennedy has been somebody who's been victim of a lot of straw manning. People are
yeah,
writing articles about who he is and what he thinks, but it's very inconsistent with what he actually says.
sure.
And I
hmm
want to relate this even back to the Trump administration. Donald Trump says all types of crazy shit all the time, right? And stuff I disagree with all the time. But right now, it's like you can't just listen to what he says. You have to watch what he actually does.
Yeah,
yeah,
What are his actual policies that he's unrolling? Because even if you look at Gaza, he's saying the craziest shit about building the Gaza Riviera, yet the ceasefire has actually still been enforced all this time. There's a ceasefire that wasn't able to be enforced in the previous administration. That Donald Trump, with his craziness and his wild approach to it, is actually, if you look at what the actual outcome is, well, the ceasefire is still enforced. Now we'll see how long that lasts because Netanyahu is certainly trying to get out of it in any way he can. But even if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, I mean, yeah, people may disagree in a lot of ways with how Donald Trump characterizes it. And, I think he said that Ukraine started the war, which is pretty absurd. I mean, I think you can say Russia was provoked, but Ukraine clearly didn't invade Russia. However, if you look at what he's actually doing, we're closer to ending that war now than we've been ever.
hmm
And there has to be this point where people stop getting outraged at every little thing somebody says and look at what their actual production is on the ground. And but back to the original point, I think that like on an issue like COVID, for example, everyone has deeply held beliefs on what happened throughout the pandemic, but very few people are actually able to get on and talk to each other and say, I actually understand the validity of where you're coming from and you're making good points. So
yeah,
where can we sort of build consensus based on the areas where we agree and where can we actually learn from each other? And again, getting back to this art of persuasion, are we open to being persuaded by good arguments, good information, somebody who knows more than us, right? And because we are going to outsource, nobody can know everything about every topic. So, what is the quality of our outsourcing? And that also speaks to discernment because if we're outsourcing some of that, then we actually have to make a determination on who do we trust, right?
yeah, yeah, 100%. And I think, when we think about going back to, I know I just said 100%. You're trying to hold back
Yeah,
that
well,
smile.
I was like, are you sure it's not 87%? But
Yeah.
maybe
Well,
It's
this
it's
is,
never
this,
100%.
100%, guys. It's never 100%. Didn't we
it's
learn
never
anything
Right?
from
100%.
what I
Yeah,
just talked about here? There's no
yeah,
certainty.
yeah.
99.9.
It's like
Yeah,
I'm a
99.
74.3% agreement, but here,
Yeah,
let me
yeah,
break down the other 15.5%.
Well, no,
yeah.
hold on a second. Hang on. I want to say something because this is a very important point, another important point, which is that there's a enormous difference between 99% and 100%.
Sure. Yeah,
Because
there is.
the 100% means you cannot be wrong.
Yeah.
1% means you have the ability to change if necessary.
Yeah.
So,
100%.
we can be sure about that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
I
uh,
wanted to tie in just the Zuckerberg thing, right? We throughout this conversation, we've talked about confusion. We've talked about just this idea that we're in a space that is almost like an evolutionary pressure for virtually everybody to try and figure out what's going on. We've talked about methodology. We've talked about all these pieces, and you know, fact checking over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, it has damaged dialogue immensely, like absolutely immensely. Because to your point, even David, when you said, "Oh, well, I went to the AI and the AI said this," and it's like, well, yeah, I went to the fact checker and the fact checker said this, and the amount of straw man arguments that have sort of been used to take down major points that, people have made, I mean, including our brand, and that now that fact checking is gone, and now that we're kind of in this position of, okay, how do we make sense of why they took down the fact checkers? Like, is Zuckerberg now on the good guys team? And what's he doing? Like, what's happening? Like, you have all these people going back to this, like trying to figure out what side is he on? What side is he on? But that's not like really the big point here. The big point here is like, we're being given more almost freedom to decide, to develop the skills of sense making, to try and understand on our own 2 feet how to be adults, right? Instead of just going to a fact checker to decide what it is. And, I think these are elements of progress, but yet, there's a whole swath of the population who says, no, this is not progress. And I do want to ask that question here, but I want to say this first because Madhava, you brought up something important, which is, you brought up the quantum post, like what do we do with that? And I actually think that there's something interesting to discuss here from the idea of what almost like new ideas does to the human mind. And it goes in this spirit of like, how do we know, or can we be uncertain? Can we develop a palate for almost like staying curious? And, for me, that's how I've always looked at some of these posts that are more benign in their discoveries, but they do something almost interesting in the realm of breaking the illusion, which is like saying, you give something to someone that almost puts them in a state of wonder for a second, like, wow, I never thought of it that way. And they're exercising a part of their mind that, yes, it doesn't necessarily tell them, well, what do we do about changing the world now with this piece of, I don't touch anything. Like, how am I going to change politics with that? Which is a great point. But there's something deeper, I think, going on in the mind and in the ways in which we look at things. And I think this is important because it's in contrast to a culture that, if you look at our music, if you look at our movies, if you look at our television shows, the stuff that's popular, so much of it is just complete and utter like distraction, formulating the old paradigm, just pushing that old way of seeing, thinking, being, just like numbing out, right? And I think there's this element of like trying to sort of get people into a space where we can be curious again. And so I wanted to throw that in there because that is the point, right? Of those kinds of posts. But kind of with that, you want to say something real quick?
Well, I want to address what you just said about
Yeah.
the utility of that kind of post. But if you're going to keep going, please go ahead.
Well, I was going to finalize with a question. So why don't you throw that in first, and then we'll go to the question.
So I completely agree with you. Those kinds of posts tend to expand a person's understanding of the fact that they can't know. I mean, just it brings you to a place of uncertainty. It's like, holy cow, even, materially touching this table is not what I think it is, right? So, boom. If we can acquiesce to the idea that we actually can't know for sure, and regard that as a feature and not as a problem with reality.
Yeah.
Now, what happens? There's something extremely important about choosing something without knowing what the answer is. And if we bring it to, let's say, a religious doctrine or ethics or morality, we have a Christian doctrine which basically says if you do all of these things, you're going to go to heaven. All of these good things, let's say, let's just put aside the savior thing, but let's just say that, do the right things and you'll be forgiven if you accept the savior. But just try to do the right things. Now, if you do those good things because you want to go to heaven, that's great. But what if if you're sure that that's what's going to happen, you are declaring yourself at a certain level of like, here's my intent, here's my willingness to do good. I'll do it if I get rewarded. versus I'm going to help and sacrifice myself to help you, not knowing whether or not I'm going to go to heaven. There's a different vibration there. You are basically offering yourself, I don't know, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And that is a very, very important distinction, I think, if we approach this metaphysically. Like, how committed are you to helping people? Will you only do it if you get rewarded, or are you going to do it anyway because you're just motivated to do it that way? I don't care if I get rewarded,
Yeah.
but I'm just going to do it that way. So the uncertainty about not knowing, or the uncertainty itself, is a feature, and it helps us really, declare ourselves in terms of how we're approaching reality. How are we oriented to this life experience? Are we going to love everyone, including ourselves, or love ourselves more than other people? That's an important distinction to make, and it only can come with uncertainty. It does not come with certainty.
Yeah, I just want to add in the importance of being comfortable with uncertainty. And in many ways, that could be described or characterized as belief or faith in terms of the religious tradition, because having a belief in something or faith in something is different from having direct knowledge of something. And even there's a lesson in the New Testament where, Jesus has been resurrected and makes an appearance, and some people see him, and then they fall to the ground and say, "Oh my God, I know the truth now," essentially. And I think Jesus says, yes, but blessed are those who do not see yet still believe, right? So there's something about the human consciousness that is not going to be able to know everything, and is going to hinge on belief or intuition,
Yeah.
or these other qualities that are important. I think in sort of the new scientific paradigm, intuition and belief are sort of trivialized as not having utility, or being something that's going to stray people from the truth. When in fact, I would argue that some of the capital T biggest truths of the universe have been revealed through people who have deep intuitive belief, and
Mm-hmm.
then scrutinize that belief and put it to the test until maybe it can be borne out with facts. But there's always going to be dynamics to our reality that are not available to us via evidentiary standard, meaning there's not going to be an evidence process that's going to confirm something as true or false. So there's always going to be that space of uncertainty. And I think being comfortable with that and also acknowledging that will bring people to more of a state of humility, as we discussed before, to where, no matter how well researched you think you may be, or how well developed your expertise may be, you have to leave some space for uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this would be, even in spirit to some extent, getting back to the scientific method for what it actually is. And obviously, we don't really see that very often in a world where science has been taken over by corruption and money and career and ego and all these different things. And I mean, this is kind of what's fascinating about the post-material science movement that's been building for years. And I feel like we've been really close to a lot of the main players in that for a long time, and just watching those ideas expand and expand and expand. It's been pretty cool, because by nature, that whole realm of post-material science looks into that uncertainty and into that non-material almost soup of infinite potential, and acknowledges its existence. And that's just really important, because, Madhava, to your point, it says that we're going to sit here and we're going to hold the fact that there's every possibility at the same time as there are some possibilities that we can see more clearly, in a sense, right? And I think it's a fascinating worldview, because this goes back to this idea of stepping out of this sort of separatist, materialistic worldview that, when you really look at it, right? Like, I think, Madhava, what you're touching on with this idea that there is uncertainty and what that changes in your mind. Imagine you had that position from when you were a little kid, and how differently that would orient you to the world in everything you've learned throughout the course of your life, versus if you're 35, 40 years old and you're hearing this thought for the first time. It may resonate in a deep way, but there's still so much that's been wired for so long about the nature of the world in that old paradigm. And it's going to take a lot of time to undo it. And so when we talk about this idea of interconnection as a new sort of feature to our worldview and what it means to really embody that and really sort of get to that space. I think it's easy to talk about sometimes, but it's hard to embody, right? It's hard to really see how this story of interconnection, this could really impact our worldview to a point where it becomes a natural way in which we kind of see everything, right? And I think we're going through a process of taking the time to really learn how to integrate that. I read it in a book, and I can spew it, let's say, through my thought, but when push comes to shove, do I actually feel that way? Do my actions represent that? Do the way that I solve problems represent that? Or am I still just thinking about myself, right? And so this kind of leads into, in a sense, this sort of one of these final questions I'd love to ask around, like, to you guys, what is progress? And I know we kind of touched on it a little bit already, but if I were to say, like, how do we know if we're making progress, like actual progress? What would you say to that?
David?
It's a good question. I think for me, we would see the expansion of human rights, the expansion of human liberty. We would start to see reflective health generated in our environment, meaning our soil and water, it gets cleaner, the human being is healthier. I think collectively we would have to get to a point where people are seeing the interconnectedness of everything in a more of a salient and dynamic way. I think progress is going to take a long time, of course, but it's to me where we have to start seeing micro examples of even if it starts in sort of isolated communities. Maybe you're looking at a community that has come together or rallied for whatever reason, and they're able to implement a system where everyone's thriving. I think that has to start sort of at the small level. I mean, it can't, in the United States system, it can't come from just the federal government and expect every single state to sort of follow suit. I think it has to come from individual communities that share and rally around common principles. And because of that, you're seeing it reflect upon the overall health of people, their access to clean water, food supplies, and also their ability to see the commonality in each other, as opposed to always looking at the differences.
Well said.
I think that it depends on where you're coming from, what progress should look like. From my perspective, as I said before, we are dealing with in a world where the battle is around control of the way we think. And how do we reconcile the difference between someone who's regarding what's happened with this recent dizzying change of events politically or scientifically? Like, I have so many friends in the medical profession that think that we are headed for a disaster with regards to public health. So, on the other hand, I'm saying, oh my God, this is a big sign of progress.
Yeah.
Right? So, who is right? And from my perspective, that's where we have to look at what is our litmus test for progress. So, without going into, my personal view, like, for example, I think we're making immense progress because everything is on the table right now.
Yep.
Like 8 years ago, after I saw what happened to Building 7, you really couldn't talk about 9/11. And now, we have a presidential task force that's looking at federal secrets, including 9/11, no matter where it goes. This is an immense, immense step in the right direction. Huge progress for me. But for other people, it would be like, oh my God, now we have a government run by conspiracy theorists. We're going the exact opposite way. So it depends on what your perspective is. Can we find a way that both sides will agree is a sign of progress? I think that without having to go to material things like, do we have more clean water? Which I think would be a step in the right direction for sure. But how about we are now reducing CO2 emissions? Is that progress or not? Well, at what expense, right? If it's the expense comes with more control and more surveillance, then I don't think it's necessarily progress. So to me, it comes down to, are we able to express ourselves freely without being censored? I'd say that's a step towards progress, regardless of what the facts are. But the liberation of people's freedom of expression, as that gets exercised, the liberation part, that's a sign of progress. It doesn't matter where it goes to, but that has to be the basis for a litmus test. Also, I would suggest that, in my perspective, the fact that we're questioning authority is a sign of progress. Mm-hmm. But this comes with the perspective that authority is bad and the truth comes from the top. If you believe that we're supposed to be told what the truth is, then this is not a sign of progress at all. So, of all the things I just talked about, I would say that if you can say what you want to say and not be shadow banned or not be punished for saying what you want to say, that is, at this moment in time, the only real litmus test for progress. Can we express ourselves and be heard without punishment? And that would be my litmus test for progress.
Yeah.
And I think we're making progress in that matter. Yeah.
I do want to say one thing, because I think that there is a genuine yearning and hunger amongst people for transparency right now. But I also see an environment where that can be exploited deeply, meaning, let's look at this 9/11 task force, for example. When you look at the people who are conducting this task force, it's very clear that they're going to actually be protecting the people who could be very well responsible for 9/11. Yet they're saying, oh, we're going to release and declassify everything around 9/11. The truth is going to come out. Even the truth about the Kennedy assassination or Epstein, right? But just by saying, hey, we're going to bring the truth out, we're opening this up, people can be like, oh my God, this is amazing. But what actually results from that is important. And an example of this is, a lot of people think Elon Musk is some champion of free speech because of his critiques of the prior regime at Twitter, which were legitimate critiques. The prior regime at Twitter was stifling free speech. They were censoring people en masse and actually colluding with government. But Elon Musk took over and did essentially the same thing, and in some respects has presided over a regime that has censored even more egregiously than the prior regime at Twitter. But people still think, because he's using the language of, I'm opening this platform up to free speech, that they'll think, oh, now free speech has has won because Elon Musk has taken over. And this gets back to, you can't look at what people say, you have to look at what they do when they're in these positions of power. And Trump is a perfect example of that, as is Elon Musk. I mean, even Trump, who everyone thinks is a protector of free speech, he's created some executive orders that are as violative of the First Amendment as you can be, stifling student protests against the war, for example, and saying, we're going to export you out of the country if we don't like what your protest. So this is another example of where people's desire for what we all rally around, these principles we think are important, bodily autonomy, freedom of expression, aren't not necessarily what they seem just because somebody is co-opting the language and understands the frustration of people. But what are they actually implementing? And this is where there can be a lot of puppeteering and smoke and mirrors going on. And again, we have to use our discernment, that just because somebody recognizes the problem and diagnoses the problem correctly doesn't mean that their solutions are what's going to get us to where we need to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point about what you said at the end there too, because I mean, I think we're seeing that with what's happening with the absolute teardown of government right now that Trump and Musk are conducting. I think we all can agree that they're exposing an incredible amount of corruption that we've all been kind of saying, hey guys, this is obviously here for so long, and that feels great in a sense. But what's going to be built out of that is a whole other question. And I think you guys mentioned a lot of interesting things when it comes to progress. I often think about things like, and it's kind of been touched upon in a lot of our conversation here, but just this idea of, if people were less almost just believing in these like almost celebrity-like figureheads that are politicians and billionaires and these different people. Like when people stop giving them this feeling of, oh yeah, they're here to save us, or just hating them reflexively. When both of those behaviors fall away, we're making progress. When we're able to, build this culture of complexity where we can withstand uncertainty, I think we're making progress. When we're less, let's say, reflexively driven by our emotions and we can still have them and still feel them, but they don't become so stuck. They don't become so constant. I think we're making progress because I think here we're sort of creating the foundations for where all of this conversation, where all of our solutions, we're identifying the problem, we're thinking 7 generations deep, for example, about how to solve something, thinking, Madhava, to your point about, if we lower CO2, at what cost, right? If we're making things safer, but we're living life less, right? When we're able to think in this way, we're making progress. And I do think to both your points, it's going to start on the ground. It's going to start with conversations like this. I think when videos like this, when conversations like this are getting more views, I think is progress, because right now it's the everyday turmoil, the hot takes from one political side or another, or one religious point of view or another. These are the things that are viral. And I think when that changes, we're making progress. Because we're moving towards something that unites us and that thinks more deeply about things, as opposed to, fast and hard and, tis what it is. But those are the things that come to mind for me.
Yeah, well said. Agreed.
Any
That's it,
other?
that's all.
That's it. I mean, that's the way she goes, right? Any other final thoughts, words as we close off this? Because it'll be like 3 years before we do this again. So even if it's next week.
Right. I know it's just good to be with you brothers and share some time, and just I really appreciate the engagement.
I would suggest, first of all, to all your listeners, engagement is really a part of why we're doing this. So, leave your critique in the comments or wherever this comes out. Share it if you think it's appropriate or helpful. And I'm always looking to do things better. So please tell me or us, especially Joe, where he got it wrong.
Yep.
Because we want to hear all that stuff. And as we move forward, don't take yourself so seriously. That would be my advice. Mm-hmm. And another piece of advice is go seek out some really funny jokes and be ready to tell them. I really think that comedy and humor is going to be more important than ever. And there's a reason for that, because humor in and of itself, when you listen to a joke and you laugh about it, why are you laughing? You're laughing because you had it wrong. The story, it almost automatically leads you to a place of humility, because the punchline came from out of nowhere and you didn't see it coming. So these are really good exercises that have nothing to do with these dark issues. But tell a good joke and listen for one, ask for one. So that would be my advice.